This is Jorge Rivera Marin, reading The Spanish Civil War by Hugh Thomas. Book 1, The Origins of the War, Chapter 2. This debate in the Cortes was the culmination of the several passionate quarrels as to how Spain should be governed, which had continued since 1808. In that year, the enfeebled monarchy made an abject surrender before Napoleon. The British, under the Duke of Wellington, helped the Spanish people to drive out the French in the ensuing War of Independence. The Bourbons were brought back in the loathsome person of Ferdinand VII, but the monarchy was no longer sacrosanct. For almost 3 centuries before 1808, Spain had been the most untroubled of European countries. From then on, it would be among the most turbulent of them. The history of the succeeding half-century was marked by a struggle over the Constitution. The contestants were the Church and the Army, the two Spanish institutions which had survived with credit from the War of Independence, the former being conservative, the latter honeycombed with free-thinking Masonic lodges. Throughout, this dispute was almost war. In 1820, liberal officers forced a constitution upon King Ferdinand, who, in 1823, brought in a French army, the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, to do away with it. In 1834, the quarrel turned into the First Carlist War, when the Church, and the advocates of regional rights in the north, rallied to the cause of Don Carlos, the brother of the dead Ferdinand. Carlos claimed the throne in the place of his infant niece, Isabella II, Ferdinand's daughter. The latter was championed by the liberals and the army, both representing the claims of Castile to dominate the peninsula. This war of religion and secession ended in 1839, when the liberals won, but peace took the form of a compromise between the armies of both sides. Carlist officers were permitted to join the regular Spanish army. Partly as a result, and partly because the confiscation of the church lands in 1837 reduced the influence of that institution, the quarrel between liberals and clerical conservatives took the form thereafter of a succession of coups d'état, pronunciamientos, by one general after another. This curious era ended in 1868, when Queen Isabella, a nymphomaniac, was herself expelled by the greatest of Spain's liberal generals, Prim. If the occasion of her departure was her excessive reliance on Father Claret, her confessor, the real cause was a revolt against the style of government over which Isabella and her court of miracles had vaguely presided. The succeeding 7 years were confused. A brother of the King of Italy, the Duke of Aosta, was brought in as King Amadeo I. This attempt at bourgeois monarchy could not contain the violence re-aroused between liberals and conservatives, newly in arms. Amadeo abdicated. The First Spanish Republic was proclaimed. This republic was, at first, intended as a federal one, in which the provinces would have substantial rights. But the intellectuals who planned this were powerless to ensure the survival of authority of any kind. In the north, the Carlists rose again under a grandson of the old pretender, and were generally supported by the church throughout the peninsula. In the south and southeast, many coastal towns proclaimed themselves independent cantons. Once again, the army eventually took power. While restoring order, the generals decided that there was no alternative save to bring back Queen Isabella's son, then a cadet at Stanhurst, as King Alfonso XII. A constitution was promulgated in 1876. Thanks to favorable European conditions of trade, Spain was prosperous in the 1880s. Universal male franchise was nominally introduced, but the results of the elections were always defrauded by an informal pact, the Turno Pacífico, between the two main parties, carried out by the agency of the Minister of the Interior and local political bigwigs, the caciques. The people of Spain came to look upon the parliamentary system, a deliberate imitation of English practice, as a means of excluding them from politics. Alfonso XII, meanwhile, died young in 1885, at the age of 28, leaving a posthumous son, Alfonso XIII, for whom his mother, Maria Cristina, ruled as regent until 1902. The pious fraud of the Constitution was one reason for the spread of revolutionary ideas throughout the working class. By the time of the First World War, there existed in Spain 2 general trade unions. The first, the CNT, the Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, was inspired by the anarchist ideas of the Russian Bakunin. The second, the UGT, Unión General de Trabajadores, was Marxist, though reformist and not revolutionary. The socialists of the UGT collaborated with the political system so far as to seek election to the Cortes, and in the cities, where the cacique's manipulation of votes became increasingly difficult, succeeded in gaining election. But the anarchists saw the Constitution as unclean, and the violence, murders, and lightning strikes undertaken intermittently by the anarchist militants kept governments in turmoil. Both these working class movements desired to regenerate Spain through education, superior public morality, pacifism, and anti-clericalism as much as through politics. Two other problems, however, caused the collapse of the constitution established at the Restoration. The first was that of Catalonia. Many Catalans aspired to recognition of their separate character from the rest of Spain. Catalonia had continued, after Spanish unification, to live as a region of its own and to look to its own capital of Barcelona, never to Madrid. The Catalan question became acute because of the industrial development of that capital during the 19th century. Irritation with the incompetence of the government at Madrid led the new rich of Barcelona at the end of the century to embrace Catalan nationalism. This, together with the anarchist faith of the workers, the high rates of illiteracy, and the demagogic atmosphere inculcated by a centralist, opportunist, but wild radical party, made Barcelona, growing fast in population at the turn of the century, the most turbulent city in Europe, the city of bombs. The Great Strike in Barcelona in 1902 and that in Bilbao in 1903 were major battles in which the nerves of all were fully extended. The ornate architecture favored by the prosperous bourgeoisie was the lavish backcloth to a mounting series of anarchist crimes. In Barcelona, a revolution does not have to be prepared, wrote the civil governor Ángel Osorio y Gallardo, since it is always ready. Meanwhile, aspirations similar to those of Catalonia began to be echoed in the more tranquil Basque provinces, where a comparably self-sufficient bourgeoisie was becoming rich from iron, banking, and commerce. The third crisis of the regime derived from the colonial wars in, first, Cuba, and then Morocco. The Cuban War of 1895 turned into the Spanish-American one of 1898. All was lost, save honor. The defeat inflamed the Catalan problem, since Cuba had been the best market for Catalan textiles. The loss of Cuba was also of psychological concern, since many Catalan fortunes had been based on Cuban commerce. In addition, the loss of the last vestige of empire caused a national crisis. It gave force to old causes of discontentment and fired new ones. The year of defeat, 1898, was thus a turning point. Spaniards were forced to think of themselves as a poor European country with few resources. Morocco, however, offered a new chance of empire, but it caused new upheavals too. Spain had held the two northern Moroccan ports of Melilla and Ceuta for several hundred years. She had tried to extend her rule there in the 1860s, and there had been further fighting near Melilla in the 1890s. Spain was understandably reluctant to allow any European power to establish herself on the north coast of Africa facing her. In 1904, as part of the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France, France and Spain divided Morocco into zones of influence, Spain taking the smaller northern part. Morocco was then backward, lawless, and ripe for European interest, if not investment, though the tribes of both zones had a formal loyalty to a sultan at Fez. The ill-informed Spanish populace was probably as critical of these high-handed arrangements as was the indolent sultan. Neither was consulted. Business, however, followed the flag. The iron mines of Morocco were rich. A gradual extension of the Spanish commerce followed, partly the reflection of similar French action. Had Spain shown no interest, France would have absorbed the whole of Morocco. A Spanish colonization company was founded, and it bought land in the wake of the troops. But then the advances stopped. Moroccan tribesmen closed ranks. A series of setbacks forced the army to call for reinforcements. In 1909, there were serious defeats. By September of that year, the Spanish army was 40,000 strong in Morocco. But it was by then committed to an imperial adventure whose only end could be the conquest of North Morocco at a cost which the country could not afford. Already there were, in 1909, horrible repercussions at home when Antonio Maura's government called up 850 reservists, some from Catalonia, all from northeast Spain. When the men went reluctantly to their ships in the harbor at Barcelona, a general strike was called in protest. A week of rioting ensued, the Semana Trágica, the tragic week of Barcelona. Radicals, socialists, and anarchists collaborated in the burning of churches that followed. Some hoped that a national revolution would ensue, but, bereft of real political direction, the rioters spent themselves in pointless destruction. While the leaders hesitated, radical women, clerks, criminals, boys, and prostitutes terrified nuns out of nunneries, burned their possessions, killed their domestic animals and chickens, and disinterred their bodies. A handsome coalman danced with one disinterred corpse outside the house of the rich Marqués de Comillas, delighted to be of use as a revolutionary. Eventually, the army resumed control. Some 120 people had been killed, 3 clergy among them. The rioters had wanted to destroy property and illusions, not life. About 50 churches or other religious buildings were burned. This disaster was a shock which seemed to show how violent a nation lay underneath the surface of constitutional rule. The authorities were less disturbed by the revolutionary expectations of the radicals or the anarchists than by the apparently meaningless destruction caused by the populace once their blood was up. The tragic week was a setback to the idea that a parliamentary democracy might gradually be established. If the masses were, as they showed themselves in 1909, the political class of the day thought, real democracy would result in ruin. Henceforward, politicians avoided general elections if they could, and tried to arrange coalitions out of groups of parliamentarians already in the legislature. The international demonstrations of outrage against the execution of the anarchist schoolmaster Ferrer, accused of being the prime organizer of the riots, also had a counterproductive effect. The upper classes saw in these protests the hypocritical, as well as hysterical and ill-informed, reactions of a mysterious coalition of international busybodies and Freemasons, soon to become sadly famous as anti-Spain. The Prime Minister, Maura, who as a result of international complaints was dismissed by the king and abandoned by conservatives, believed that this surrender in the Cortes after the victory in the streets doomed the regime, since it had been seen to have given way to disorder, propaganda, and malice. Thereafter, the Conservative Party, which had held together since the 1870s, followed the liberals into disintegration. Maura moved into the wings of politics as the focus of a movement of young men angry with parliamentarism, anxious for regeneration, but unable to gain a majority for a government. In Maurismo, there were to be seen the springs of fascism, evident in other countries before 1914 as well, with the Roulette and Mauras in France, D'Annunzio in Italy, and even the Ulster Volunteers. Maura promised a revolution from above. The militias said that he merely desired a revolution without a revolution. The Moroccan War continued. Tangier, North Morocco's best port, was excluded from the Spanish Protectorate in 1912 as an international city, and the tribes refused to accept the Spanish civilizing presence. Men, money, food, and emotion continued to be poured into the country by a Spain that could only afford the first. The tribes had never been subject to the Sultan. Only Spain gave them a unity. In seeking an empire, Madrid thus helped to inspire nationalism. The 3 main problems in modern Spain, working class unrest, the regional question, and the colonial wars, ruined the Restoration settlement. Perhaps anyways that political edifice was too fragile to be able to outlive for long the gifted conservative historian Cánovas, its main architect, and Sagasta, the old shepherd, his liberal opponent. Personalities count in modern politics as much as they did in the epoch of kings. Cánovas was assassinated. Sagasta died. Maura failed as a potential successor to Cánovas as much to the strength of his personality as to the weakness of his program. Sagasta's ultimate successor, José Canalejas, was, it was true, a journalist, orator, and reformer of the First Order. His government between 1910 and 1912 seemed a time of battle against the clerical control of education and the freedom of the orders to organize schools without inspection. In fact, Canalejas revised the system of taxation to benefit the poor, temporarily solved the Catalan question by the grant of mancomunidad, limited self-government, and reached a compromise with the church in the Ley de Candado, law of the padlock, which limited the growth of religious orders unless they had government permission. Canalejas also abolished the practice whereby the rich could buy themselves out of military service. Well might an English historian celebrate him as the only liberal who got things done. He was assassinated by an anarchist in 1912. His successors as liberal leaders, the Conde de Romanones, Garcia Prieto, Santiago Alba, had neither Canalejas' energy nor his gifts. The First World War brought the problems of Restoration Spain to a climax. The conflict benefited all neutral nations, and in Spain it created wealth, contrasting with surviving poverty. Basque ships, Catalan textiles, Asturian coal, zinc, and copper gained high prices. The consequent inflation was felt most by the working class, though wages went up too, and in some jobs outstripped prices. Huge numbers of workers were, as it were, sucked up to Barcelona on the train from Murcia and Almeria, which became known as the Transmiseriano. The atmosphere was confused by sterile arguments as to which side Spain should support in the war. The left were mostly pro-Ally, the right mostly pro-German, so that the king could say that only he and the rabble hoped that Britain would win. Meantime, the government of the Conde de Romanones, who personally preferred the Allies, was turning a blind eye to the activities of terrorists financed by German agents who attacked pro-Allied industrialists. Romanones himself resigned on the issue of whether German submarines should be allowed to use Spanish bases to refit in the Battle of the Atlantic. The army now re-entered politics. Their position had been complicated by the growth of juntas de defensa, professional associations of junior infantry officers protesting against the low pay which, like that of agricultural workers, had not kept pace with inflation. The juntas also disliked promotion by combat merits, or royal favoritism, which was enjoyed by the officers fighting in Morocco. The juntas were founded in Barcelona and spread all over Spain. In May 1917, their leader, Coronel Benito Marquez, a foolish, deaf officer, was arrested for insubordination with some colleagues. Other junteros asked to be arrested too. The king ensured the release of all of them, and the government fell. All politicians were shocked at this apparent new surrender. But the press liked the juntas, and gave publicity to the notion that they might take the first step in a nationwide movement of regeneration. Cambó, the financier who was the leader of the Catalan movement, the Liga Regionalista, founded in 1901, thought so too. Meantime, in the south of Spain, the intoxicating news of the Russian Revolution inspired widespread unrest, including occupations of land and intimidation of rural guards, these actions being mostly inspired by anarchists. While in Barcelona, the anarchist unions believed that the crisis offered them a new opportunity. In the face of this multi-sided challenge, a new government, headed by a conventional conservative, Eduardo Dato, suspended constitutional guarantees and closed the Cortes. The more progressive politicians, outraged, responded by convening an alternative assembly of Catalan nationalists, which met in Barcelona to renovate the Spanish constitution. The government declared this seditious and introduced censorship. The assembly movement might have gone far had it not been for reckless action by the left. The socialists, caught up in the mood of the moment, had, in 1916, deserted their cautious reformism and prepared a general strike aiming at revolution. Their program provided for the end of the monarchy, a 7-hour working day, the abolition of the army and its substitution by a militia, separation of church and state, nationalization of land, the closure of monasteries and nunneries, and, important in 1917, no declaration of war unless there were a plebiscite. Dato took a firm hand. He first defined a railway strike as a threat to the state and treated it accordingly. The government had encouraged the railway companies to take a hard line. Playing on the knowledge that the junteros also opposed any alteration of the social order, and that Catalan progressive bourgeoisie, however truculent, desired anything rather than revolution, the government met the general strike with force. The socialists thought that for once they had made a satisfactory alliance with the anarchists, as with some politicians of the center, but their tactics had not been well coordinated, and the strike failed. The army directed the subsequent repression, the junteros being deaf to the appeals of socialists. 70 people were killed, mostly in Barcelona, fighting to keep or to prevent the trams running, and the Catalan Liga, shaken by the upheaval for which they had been partly responsible, agreed to participate in a coalition government led by Maura, which bought off the Junteros with promotions. The unofficial parliamentary assembly did meet again, in Madrid, but the mood was cautious. It called for a constituent Cortes to rewrite the constitution, and was not heard of again. Cambó now entered the government as Minister of Development. It was his great opportunity, and he showed himself as able planner as he had been a moneymaker. But the administration did not last, nor did any other. For nearly 5 years, a series of conservative governments failed even to restore quarrels in the Conservative Party. They were quite unable to deal with the consequences of a post-war economic recession, accompanied by continuing setbacks in Morocco and working-class violence in both Andalusia and Barcelona. The wonder is not that the constitution was overthrown in the end, but that it lasted as long as it did in a country where military intervention had occurred so often. Perhaps it did not last really after 1917. A democracy can hardly be said to exist if several provinces are only kept from revolution by the brutality of the civil guard, and the largest industrial city from civil war by counterterrorism sponsored by industrialists and winked at by the police. Perhaps the world economic situation was partly to blame. During the war, Spanish employers had expanded their enterprises, but had now to contract. They would fight labor now, since there was a glut of workers. In the war, there had been a shortage. But in the clash of labor and capital, between 1917 and 1923, a class war was to be seen which often came close to outright conflict, and over issues other than economic. Employers believed themselves threatened by bankruptcy, if not revolution. The anarchists believed that they were on the brink of the millennium. Since, whatever the views of the central government, the local military authorities usually agreed with the employers, and often arrested strikers, the character of the conflict became more and more violent. The rule of General Martínez Anido, previously known as a sanguinary governor Melilla, as civil governor of Barcelona from 1920 to 1922, was ruthless, a type of repression not seen in Spain for generations. He gave support to the Sindicatos Libres, free syndicates, which seemed more and more an employers' union of strikebreakers, though they had some backing from Catholic social reformers. Gunmen infiltrated them, and terrorism flourished among the anarchists. In other parts of Spain, there were similar tragic events. In Andalusia, anarchist committees seized municipal governments. Landowners left. Increased wages were won, but the army overcame the strikers. In Madrid, where there were also severe strikes in 1921, socialists and anarchists fought each other, each regarding the others as traitors. In the end, the anarchists ruined their chances of revolution, such as those were, by internal disputes. Many leaders were murdered. So too was the conservative Prime Minister Dato. By 1923, the CNT was exhausted. So was Spain. Violent reactions have been shown to be increasing on every side of public life, and enmities have been made which would never be forgotten. Not for the last time, the anarchists helped to wreck a system which, for all its faults, was susceptible of peaceful change, and whose successor will be less to their liking. The Moroccan Wars continued to tie down the Spanish army. After some minor victories, a slow campaign against the Riffian tribes, led by the brilliant Abdelkrim and his brother, culminated in the defeat at Anual in 1921. There, General Fernandez Silvestre, a romantic, popular, but imprudent officer, a friend of the king's, was overwhelmed with all his staff. The army in East Morocco panicked. One Spanish fort after another fell, and the Riffians reached the outskirts of Melilla. At least 15,000 Spanish citizens and soldiers were killed. The disaster was shocking. Even more so, the inquiry, directed by General Picasso, which revealed a fearful state of unpreparedness impossible to overlook. Abdelkrim's rebellion and the virtual achievement of a Riffian state, despite the 150,000 Spanish troops seeking his defeat, proved that, while the French under the great Liaute had achieved much in Morocco, the Spaniards had done little in their zone. Furthermore, the king was believed to have given Silvestre encouragement by telegram for his rashness. All this, and the responsibility for the disaster, was expected to come into the open in the autumn of 1923. The Cortes adjourned for the summer, and never met again in the same way. By 1923, the constitutional monarchy seemed bruised to death, even though one threat, that of the Junteros, had been removed by their dissolution a year before. Partly because of the local power of the caciques, the political parties of the Restoration had failed to develop much beyond the semi-social gatherings which met in cafes around a single figure. Some of the politicians, such as those in the Republican Reformist Party, were Democrats, but public opinion had no love for this Cortes. The politicians, for their part, knew that the army would not resist a popular general. There was thus no will to oppose an ultimatum presented in the 19th century style by the chosen leader of a group of important generals, General Miguel Primo de Rivera, Captain General of Catalonia. We have reason on our side and, therefore, force, though so far we have used force with moderation. If an attempt is made to trick us into a compromise which our conscience considers dishonorable, we shall demand greater penalties and impose them with greater severity. Neither I nor the garrisons of Aragon, from whom I have just received a telegram in support, will agree to anything but a military dictatorship. If the politicians make an attempt to defend themselves, we shall do the same, relying on the help of the people, whose reserves of energy are great. Today we are resolved on moderation, but, on the other hand, we shall not shrink from bloodshed. The dictatorship of General Primo de Rivera followed. King Alfonso acquiesced, knowing beforehand what was planned. He was exasperated with politicians and liked soldiers. This new system lasted until January 1930. My Mussolini was how King Alfonso presented Primo to King Victor Emmanuel of Italy. But the general was no fascist. He was already 53 in 1923, white-haired though tough. He possessed neither mass following nor an expansionist foreign policy. He would have given up Morocco if he could have done so. The movement which he tried to create, the Patriotic Union, an association of all men of goodwill, never gathered weight. Although he used officers to run the municipal governments for 3 years, imprisoned or exiled those who opposed him, and banned political parties, there were no political executions during his 6.5 years in power. His pronunciamiento was even welcomed at first by intellectuals such as José Ortega y Gasset, who thought that an iron surgeon was needed for Spain's illnesses. So did both surviving junteros and officers serving in Morocco, agreeing for once. The Minister of the Interior and the Director General of Security, always an important official in Spain, were, however, General Martínez Anido and Arlegui, the ruthless rulers of Barcelona between 1920 and 1922. These officers kept political parties out of sight. Meantime, an ambitious program of public works, new dams, railways, rural electrification, and roads, gave the dictatorship the appearance of prosperity. The terms of trade improved, as everywhere in the late 1920s, and both production and commerce increased 300%. The socialists agreed to collaborate, and the UGT, unlike their anarchist rivals, bid fair to become a kind of official trade union such as was found in Sweden. The financial policy of the young José Calvo Sotelo gained for Primo the support of Spanish capital, and banks for the first time interested themselves in development through credit. Maura's influence was indirectly considerable on this regime, to which he gave no formal backing. It was an era of wonderful schemes, in Spain as elsewhere. A great waterway project was begun in the Ebro and Douro valleys, and there was a famous industrial exhibition in Barcelona. Vast stadia were built, preparing the way for the rise of football and the expansion of bullfighting. Production was successful in light industry. Above all, the dictator miraculously brought to a successful conclusion the running sore of the Moroccan War, although Abd al-Krim had really beaten the Spaniards before the French were drawn into the conflict. Abd al-Krim went into captivity in Reunion Island, and it seemed, and seeming was what mattered, that Spain had won a military victory for the first time in many generations. Yet, the dictatorship can only be measured by the personality of Primo de Rivera himself. He was patriotic, magnanimous, sympathetic, and tolerant, while his physical and his moral courage in Cuba, the Philippines, and Morocco were well attested. Once he entered a theater and began to smoke, while notices everywhere proclaimed that smoking was forbidden. On being informed of this, he rose and announced, cigar in hand, "Tonight, everyone may smoke." A widower, he would work hard for months on end and then disappear for a lost weekend of dancing, drinking, and love-making with gypsies. He would be observed almost alone in the streets of Madrid, swathed in an opera cloak, making his way from one cafe to another, and, on returning home, would issue a garrulous and sometimes intoxicated communiqué, full of unexpected metaphors and embarrassing confidences, which he might have to cancel in the morning. He desired to run Spain as an enlightened despot, at a time, however, when despotism could only last if it were brutal. Primo de Rivera fell in the end, partly because he persecuted, but did not crush, the liberal and professional middle class. For example, the affair of La Caoba, the Mahogany Girl, scandalized many. La Caoba was an Andalusian courtesan who, when implicated in a drug case, appealed to Primo de Rivera. The dictator ordered the judge to release her. The judge refused and was supported in this by the president of the Supreme Court. Primo transferred the first and sacked the latter. Those who protested, such as Unamuno, the philosopher, poet, journalist, and professor of Greek, were sent to confinement on the hot Canary island of Fuerteventura. This action was unfortunately symptomatic of Primo's attitude to law, whose rules he made and broke with impunity. The practice subverted more than his system. It prepared the way for a reckless attitude in the 1930s on the part of the Spanish right, which would have been unheard of in the 19th century. Primo also offended the army, and even the king, by changes which would have affected the delicate matter of promotions in the Corps of Artillery. When the artillery officers tried to protest, Primo closed down the corps and released the men from their oaths of obedience to their officers. Similarly, Orthodox bankers were alarmed by Calvo Sotelo's plans for income tax, and, even more, by the extraordinary budget, whose aim was to finance public works from loans, the interest upon which would be met out of revenue. Nobody, save the beneficiaries, liked the monopolies for telephones granted to the American International Telegraph and Telephone Company, the sale of petrol granted to CAMPSA, the group of banks, or tobacco in Morocco, sold to the Majorcan millionaire Juan March, especially when the consequence of the petrol monopoly was to make the country dependent on Russian oil. Primo's consultative and nominated National Assembly drafted a new constitution, in which the elected and the corporative element were combined. The first disturbed the right, the second was rejected by liberals and the left. Nor did the king like a scheme which envisioned him sharing his powers of dismissal with a Spanish version of Mussolini's Grand Fascist Council. So this scheme did not point the way to a return to normality, such as the dictator expected. When he abolished press censorship, he received a hail of criticism. The students opposed him bitterly. There were two unsuccessful pronunciamientos against him, in Valencia and Andalusia, the one led by a 70-year-old conservative politician, Sanchez Guerra, and the other by the ambitious young General Godet, who had been chief of staff to the victorious field commander General Sanjurjo in the Moroccan campaign. The era of pronunciamientos seemed to have begun again. The peseta fell, while the slump of 1929 caused the collapse of several of those grandiose financial schemes which Calvo Sotelo had introduced. The coming of cinemas and the radio and the extension of the use of the telephone and the motor car raised popular expectations, particularly the cinemas, which were there more in Spain by 1930 than in France. In the end, desirous of reassurance, Primo took the curious step of addressing a telegram to all captain generals of Spain, asking them to find out if the senior officers still supported him. They wrote back mentioning their loyalty to the monarch. Few mentioned the dictator. The king told Primo that he was prime minister not by virtue of the army's support, but by the king's command. Alfonso now thought that he might be the savior of Spain himself, and made it plain that he hoped that Primo would retire. He did so. And now, the dictator remarked, in the last of his famous communiques, and now for a little rest, after 2,326 days of continuous uneasiness, responsibility, and labor. He left Spain and died a few months later in the Hôtel Pont Royal in Paris, alone and unhappy. He was only 60. He left behind him no basis for a regime. For a while, the king attempted to govern as Primo had governed, through a directory of ministers led by General Berenguer, who had been an able and honest high commissioner in Morocco, but was no politician. It would anyway have tried the most skillful statesman to lead Spain back to the Constitution of 1876, as the king desired. Berenguer himself said that he assumed power when Spain was like a bottle of champagne about to blow out its cork. Republican sentiment spread through the country. Many army officers, as well as the remains of Primo's patriotic union, felt that the king had behaved dishonorably in accepting the dictator's resignation. Others were now unrepentant Republicans. The church was equivocal, with some of its most influential figures concerned, following the still Winsonian mood of Pope Pius XI, to establish a democratic system, if at all possible. Other churchmen were more opportunistic. Neither bourgeoisie nor lower classes had anything to hope for from a continuance of the monarchy. The king, however, was not prepared to establish a royal dictatorship of the Balkan type, and General Berenguer dilly-dallied before calling for elections. In the summer of 1930, a pact was signed at the summer watering place of San Sebastian between several Republican politicians and intellectuals, the socialists, and the advocates of Catalan nationalism. The former conceded autonomy for the Catalans, who, in return, agreed to support the Republican plots, such as they were. In Madrid, three eminent intellectuals, Dr. Gregorio Marañón, Ortega y Gasset, and the novelist Ramón Pérez de Ayala, formed themselves into a movement for the service of the Republic. Ortega, whose earlier well-phrased criticisms of Parliament had helped Primo, wrote a famous article announcing, "Spaniards, your state is no more. Reconstitute it. Delenda est monarquía." More importantly, several discontented officers supported the rebels, and even the anarchists, submerged but alive, gave weary sympathy to the bourgeois opponents of the king. In December, a pronunciamiento was prepared. The plotters issued the following statement. A passionate demand for justice surges upwards from the bowels of the nation. Placing their hopes in a republic, the people are already in the street. We would have wished to communicate the people's desires through the due process of law, but this path has been barred to us. When we have demanded justice, we have been denied liberty. When we have demanded liberty, we have been offered a rump parliament like those of the past, based on fraudulent elections, convoked by dictatorship, the instrument of a king who has already broken the Constitution. We do not covet the culminating drama of a revolution, but the misery of the people of Spain moves us greatly. Revolution will always be a crime or an act of insanity when law and justice exist, but is always just when tyranny prevails. These Republicans were men who not only opposed the idea that a single man, even if a Bourbon, could dismiss and appoint a prime minister, but who also saw in the idea of the abolition of the monarchy a step towards the modernization of Spain. The sequel was swift. First, a garrison at Jaca, in Aragon, in the foothills of the Pyrenees, led by two zealous young officers, Captain Fermín Galán and Lieutenant García Hernández, rose against the monarchy before the conspirators in the rest of Spain gave the word. Captured while marching their men in the direction of Zaragoza, the two officers were shot for rebellion. The indignation at the executions was great. Elsewhere, the movement failed. A young captain in the Air Force, Ramón Franco, a national hero because of his pioneering flight in the non plus ultra across the South Atlantic to Buenos Aires, set out to bomb the royal palace, hesitated, and dropped pamphlets instead. He then fled to Portugal. The signatories of the Pact of San Sebastián were arrested. When they were tried, they defended themselves by saying that the king had broken the constitution by accepting Primo de Rivera as dictator. From their much-visited cells, the Republicans' reputation grew. Several small parties were founded to raise enthusiasm for the monarchy. They failed to do so. Primo de Rivera's patriotic union converted as a monarchical union, but defended the memory of the dictator, not the future of the king. General Berenguer hesitantly offered elections. The idea was refused as insincere, and the general, ill, resigned thankfully. After unsuccessful negotiations with politicians, the king named as Prime Minister Admiral Aznar, who was unknown and inexperienced. He and the king decided to test opinion by holding municipal, not general elections in April. In the interim, student riots of a violent kind forced the civil guard onto the defensive. These local elections were held in an exuberant atmosphere and assumed the character of a plebiscite. Huge meetings were addressed all over the country by would-be politicians of every sort. When the final results of the poll on 12 April began to come in, it was obvious that, in all the large towns of Spain, the candidates who supported the monarchy had been defeated. The size of the Republicans' vote in Madrid and Barcelona, then with populations of 950,000 and 1,000,000 respectively, was enormous. In the country, the monarchy gained enough seats to secure for its friends a majority in the nation as a whole, but it was realized that, there, the caciques were powerful enough to prevent a fair vote. In several places, a republic was proclaimed, the first being in Eibar, in the Basque provinces. By the evening of 14 April, crowds were gathering in the streets of Madrid. The cabinet, aghast and intimidated, advised the king to accept the Republican leader's advice, to leave the capital before sunset to prevent bloodshed. Only one minister, Juan de la Cierva, the Minister of the Interior at the time of the tragic week in 1909, wanted to resist. If the king had done so, he might have triumphed in Madrid, but he would have found the provincial capitals disposed to fight. A civil war might there and then have followed. At least one of the king's cousins wanted him to hold on, but Alfonso issued a dignified announcement. Sunday's elections have shown me that I no longer enjoy the love of my people. I could very easily find the means to support my royal powers against all comers, but I am determined to have nothing to do with setting one of my countrymen against another in a fratricidal civil war. Thus, until the nation speaks, I shall deliberately suspend the use of my royal prerogatives. With these grave and cryptic words, the king drove away from Madrid to the coast and to exile. The experiment of constitutional monarchy tried between 1874 and 1923 failed because it was a defensive political arrangement brought into effect in reaction to the revolutionary confusion of 1868 to 1874. Its statesmen could, to begin with, play on the desire for survival, ansia de vivir, which affects even the poor after an upheaval. The turbulence revived, and Primo de Rivera could, for a time, count again on that conservative mood. He believed that only an authoritarian system could preside over Spain's modernization. The succeeding years, particularly after the flight of the king, were again tumultuous, despite their orderly beginning. Thus many came to believe that Primo de Rivera's work could be continued in a more well-regulated manner, while others also sought authority since they feared the future. For the time being, however, the destiny of Spain was in the hands of those who welcomed change and the opportunities it offered.